In this video, we're going to discuss how California bar exam essays are graded. The written portion of the California bar exam consists of 5 essays and 1 performance test. There is a possible 700 raw points available for the written portion of the exam. That breaks down to 100 raw points per essay question and 200 raw points for the performance test. So let's look at how those essays are scored. The essays scored on a 100-point scale are actually scored on a scale from 40 to 100. California has said in order to achieve a score of 40, all you have to do is identify the subject matter being tested and attempt to apply the law to the facts of the question. If you make that minimal attempt, you'll get that minimal score of 40. Now, if you don't even make that minimal attempt, like let's say, for instance, if you run out of time and don't get to a final essay, you would get a score of 0 for that essay. So there's nothing between a 0 and a 40. You either get a 0 for making no attempt or a 40 as a minimum score for making some minor attempt. So they typically score on a scale from 40 to 100, assuming that you've made some attempt at the question. A score of 65 is on average considered passing. So you're really aiming for about a 65 on each of your essays to ensure that you get the score you need to pass the written portion of the exam. Now, those 700 raw points, those are exactly as I said, raw points. So what they do is they take your score out of 700 and they scale it. And they don't release a lot of information about how this formula or this math happens, but they equate your 700-point raw score onto a scale that makes your essay portion of your exam equivalent to the weight of your MBE portion of the exam. California's exam is scored on a total 2,000-point scale. So really, they're equating the 700-point raw score onto a 1,000-point scale. And then the MBE portion is scored on a 1,000-point scale as well. So each portion is worth 50% of your total bar exam score. Now, I said you generally need about a 65 to pass the written portion of the exam, but you don't have to hit any necessary threshold of the written portion to necessarily pass. 65 is not the absolute minimum necessary to pass. You could make up for a lower essay portion score with a higher MBE score, for instance, because California takes those 2 scaled scores, your MBE scaled score and your essay scaled score, and they average them out. But in general, you're aiming for about a 65 to achieve a passing score on the written portion of the exam. So how exactly do you get that 65? Where do the points come from on California's exams? The first thing that you're going to get points for is spotting the correct issues. California's essays tend to be open-ended, where they'll give you a fact pattern, and then at the end of the fact pattern, it'll say something like, discuss the issues, or address the arguments that this person will raise. And so it's up to you to utilize the facts and identify the legal issues that need to be addressed. So a fact pattern typically has major issues and then also may have some minor issues. The major issues are the ones that are clearly screaming to be addressed by the facts that they've presented here. And in order to get that score of 65, you typically need to address all of the major issues. It's important that you spot these major issues. For the minor issues, it is possible to get a passing score without necessarily spotting or addressing every single minor issue. So how do you tell if an issue is a major issue or a minor issue? Well, when you're doing practice questions, if you look at the sample student answers, and California typically releases 2 sample student answers for every essay, if they both addressed the same issue, that's an indicator that that is a major issue and must be addressed in order to achieve a passing score on that exam. If, on the other hand, the 2 sample student answers took different approaches, maybe one of them addressed a few extra minor issues that the other one didn't approach or didn't address, that's an indicator that those are minor issues. They may generate some additional points, but discussing them probably isn't necessary to a proper passing score on that particular essay. So keep working on some practice essays and be sure to check the sample student answers and look at what issues they identify. And that's going to be an indicator as to whether you have major issues that must be identified or minor issues that'll help you, but maybe don't have to be identified. The second place you're going to get points on a California essay is by correctly stating the law. After you identify the issue, you want to make sure that you have a proper and correct rule statement identifying the applicable law. How much detail to include in your rule statement depends on the issue. Sometimes they're looking for a very specific, very direct rule statement identifying the exact issue being tested. Sometimes they're looking for a little bit more background information. The amount of detail needed changes from one issue to another. So pay attention to how much detail the sample student answers provide in their rule statements to give you a good indicator of exactly how much to include in your own rule statements. The third place you'll get points is by analyzing the facts, and this is probably where the bulk of your points come from. It's important that you spot the right issues so that you can perform this analysis portion, but really your points are coming from the analysis. The California essay fact patterns tend to be fairly short. They're usually somewhere between a half a page and a full page of writing, so they don't give you a ton to work with. So there's a really good chance that every fact that they give you is there for a reason. So it is crucial that you make sure to utilize all of those facts in your answer. You may also need to identify missing facts. Sometimes the fact pattern is so short that you need additional facts to fully analyze these issues, in which case you should mention that in your analysis. Bring up the additional facts that you would need to know. Not that you should make them up, but pointing out that additional facts are necessary to reach a full and final conclusion is definitely something that will generate some points in the analysis portion of your essay. You also want to consider raising arguments for both sides here. If it's possible that each side has a valid argument on a particular issue, discuss that here. You could say, Bob will likely argue, and then on the other hand, Ann will counter argue, and then tell who has the stronger argument. But by identifying both sides of an argument, you're really showing the grader that you can think analytically and you see all pieces or all sides of an issue. Fourth, you'll get points for reaching the correct conclusion sometimes. There isn't always a correct conclusion. And again, you can tell if there is a correct conclusion by looking at those sample student answers. If both sample student answers reach the same conclusion on a particular issue, it may be the case that the facts were so heavily leaning one way that there is a right answer. But it's also possible that the sample student answers have reached opposite conclusions, which tells us that those facts are kind of vague and maybe do have a chance at being argued both ways. In which case, you'll probably get points for concluding, but there isn't necessarily a correct conclusion. So you won't get marked down for reaching the wrong conclusion there. So let's take a look at a sample essay, what it would look like, and how we would attack it to get the most points possible. This essay comes from the February 2019 exam, and this is the Torts essay. It says, Dan, a dog breeder, had some 8-week-old puppies to sell. Bob and Carol went to his house to look at them. Dan invited them into the living room where the puppies were located and said, whatever you do, don't go into the room at the end of the hall. As they were examining the puppies, the largest puppy, without warning, gave Carol a nasty bite on her hand. Dan told Bob to go to the bathroom near the end of the hall to retrieve some bandages. Forgetting Dan's earlier admonition, Bob opened the door at the end of the hall, thinking it was the bathroom, and entered a darkened room where Dan kept an enormous pet chimpanzee. The chimpanzee jumped between Bob and the door, beat its chest, and made menacing hoots. Frightened, Bob stood still. In attending to Carol's bite, Dan mistakenly grabbed a bottle of heavy-duty solvent, thinking it was a bottle of antiseptic. When Dan rubbed its contents into Carol's wound, she began to scream and shout in pain. Hearing Carol's cries, Bob barged past the chimpanzee, which gave him a deep gash to his head as he passed. Shaken and sore from their injuries, Bob and Carol fled Dan's house. Bob and Carol filed a lawsuit against Dan to recover for their injuries. Number 1, what claims may Carol reasonably raise against Dan? What arguments may Dan reasonably make? And what is the likely outcome? Discuss. And number 2, what claims may Bob reasonably raise against Dan? What arguments may Dan reasonably make? And what is the likely outcome? And discuss. So as you can see here, they don't identify the exact legal issues that we need to discuss. They tell us to identify the claims that Carol and Bob will raise against Dan. They also did specifically tell us to consider Dan's responses. So we need to consider for Bob and Carol's claims what defenses Dan may be able to raise that go along with those claims. So what issues could possibly be raised in response to this question? There's quite a few you could potentially raise. So starting with number 1, which was Carol, well, she was injured when she was bit by the dog. That was her first injury. It's possible to make an argument for strict liability here. It's also possible to make an argument for negligence. So think about Carol's possible arguments. Even if it's unlikely that she would succeed in, let's say, strict liability, it's still a good idea to raise it as a possible argument. What we'll do is just show why she won't succeed there. The call of the question simply said, what claims may she reasonably raise? Not claims that she's likely to win or what claims will likely be successful. So we want to think about anything she could possibly argue. So there's 2. With regard to the other injury for the solvent, it's the possible claim there would likely be negligence. There's also a minor premises liability claim as invitees onto Dan's property. Carol and Bob potentially have a cause of action in negligence as invitees. And then for Bob's defenses, since all of Carol's claims sound in negligence, Bob's defenses should sound in negligence. So Bob could raise, for instance, contributory negligence, comparative negligence, and assumption of the risk. The bolded issues here are the issues that are probably the major issues. You probably need to identify and address strict liability for the dog bite, negligence for the dog bite, negligence for the solvent injury, some discussion of contributory and or comparative negligence. If you combine them into one issue, that's likely fine, and probably assumption of the risk. Bob's claims arising out of that chimpanzee injury could be strict liability or negligence or premises liability. And then again, Dan would likely raise the same defenses, but it would be important to analyze them twice because the analysis could be different for Bob than it was for Carol. So we've identified all of these potential issues that could be addressed by this pretty short fact pattern. So there's a lot to address here. So as you can see from this sample student answer, this is the first answer that California selected as being a high-scoring student answer to this particular essay. They go into a lot of detail. This is a pretty lengthy answer. Keep in mind, as you're looking at the sample student answers, California has selected these as what they consider the best answers to this question. They're not necessarily just passing answers, but they're fantastic answers. It's very easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information these students have presented in their essays. It is entirely possible to get a passing score without nearly this much detail if you are not a fast typer and simply don't have time to include quite so much detail here. But if you take a look at this first issue, which was strict liability that we identified in that list above, I want to look at the sample student answer and point out how much detail they include, particularly in their analysis, to see what a really good answer would look like. So here for strict liability, this student has said, Carol could claim that Dan is strictly liable for the injuries caused by the puppy who bit her hand. Now we have the rule. The owner of a wild animal is strictly liable for any injuries caused by the animal's dangerous propensities. So the rule is with regard to a wild animal. Here we have a puppy. So it says a puppy would likely not be considered a wild animal for strict liability purposes. However, the owner of an animal with known dangerous propensities is also strictly liable for any damage caused by the animal's dangerous propensities. An owner will not be charged with knowing the dangerous propensities unless some circumstances exist which give him reason to know of the animal's dangerous propensities, such as prior incident or biting. So that's the detail that they've included in their rule statement. A puppy is usually not a wild animal for purposes of strict liability, but if there was something to indicate that this puppy was in fact dangerous, strict liability might nonetheless apply. So moving into the analysis, this student states, here, Carol will argue that Dan should have known that the largest puppy had dangerous propensities. However, this is unlikely to be successful because the facts indicate that the puppy bit Carol without warning. So notice how this student is analyzing both sides of the issue. Carol will argue that it was unreasonably dangerous, it had dangerous propensities, it was the largest puppy. On the other hand, Dan will respond by saying that this puppy had never done anything like this before, so how could he have possibly known this could happen? They go on to say further, it is generally known that puppies have a tendency to nip and chew, but they don't bite hard enough to give nasty bites, often enough that a reasonable person would know of a dangerous propensity to give nasty bites. So now we have a conclusion, and it says, thus, Carol will not succeed in showing that Dan should be strictly liable on the basis of a known dangerous propensity. Carol will need to claim for her damages under a theory of negligence, which is the next issue that they go into. But I want to point out that it could be pretty easy to overlook this issue. You might think strict liability only applies to wild animals. This is a puppy, not a wild animal. Strict liability isn't a possibility, and not discuss it at all. But you would get points here for discussing this issue. Even though it's unlikely she could succeed, showing the grader why she's unlikely to succeed is going to generate some significant credit. And the hint that tells me that this is a major issue is the fact that in the fact pattern, they went out of their way to tell us that their puppy had never done anything like this before, that the puppy bit Carol without warning. So Dan had no idea that something like this could happen. So because we had facts that went along with potential strict liability, it was important that we addressed strict liability and fully addressed it just as this student did here. They go on to do this for each of those other issues that we identified. So you can see for negligence, they identified the elements of negligence, and then they analyze in detail each and every element: duty, the standard of care, breach, causation, both actual and proximate cause, and damages. They go on to do the same thing for the solvent injury: duty, breach, causation, damages. They then go into those arguments that Dan could raise: contributory negligence, comparative negligence, and assumption of the risk. They identify all three of them here. And then finally, they go into Bob's claims. Again, strict liability for the chimpanzee injury, and then the defenses. If the claims are similar, you don't have to go through the rule statement twice. You can always say see above. If you've correctly stated the rule previously, you're generally not going to get credit for correctly stating the rule again. So as you can see here, the student says, as discussed above, and they quickly summarize negligence. So you don't have to include a detailed rule statement again, but they do go through and analyze the facts relevant to Bob's claim for negligence. So as I said, this is a very detailed student answer. This is a high scoring student answer. This is more than what you need to pass. But as you're practicing, it's a good idea to aim high and try to think about how to get the most possible points out of an essay. So you can use these to see where you could generate additional points by discussing different issues, maybe the minor issues, adding more detail to your analysis, arguing both sides, bringing up facts that are unknown and how that could affect the analysis. These are all ways that you'll maximize your points on a California essay. So finally, I want to talk about exactly how California goes about grading these essays, because it's helpful to keep in mind who the grader is and how they're grading. So California's essays are graded by hired attorneys that the state bar pays to grade these essays. They are reading tons of essays. They're probably reading hundreds of essays each. So California spends some time calibrating these graders. So they all get together, and California kind of teaches them what a 65 looks like so that they understand how to give scores to these different essays, and so that how your essay is scored doesn't necessarily change from one grader to another. After they grade your essays and then they scale your score, so remember California's bar exam is graded on a 2,000 point scaled score, you need a score of 1390 on California's bar exam to pass. They give kind of a built-in appeals period here in California, or review, where if your score is close to passing, if you are between a 1350 and a 1390, what they do is they pull your essays out and they read them again. They want to make sure, if you are super duper close, they want to make sure that the essay graders were right when they scored your essays. So they'll grade them again, and then they take the average of those two essay scores, and those averages are used to calculate your raw writing score out of 700 points. And then they rescale that written portion of the exam to the MBE portion of the exam. So they do build in some protection here. They understand that grading is a subjective process. They build in a little protection to make sure that everyone is scored fairly. But if you take those tips from above and you maximize your points in your essay to begin with, hopefully you don't even fall within that window, and you'll clearly have a passing score on all of your essays without that need for the additional review.